OCO and greetings. I'm Jay Winter Nightwolf, and this is Jay Winter Nightwolf Live, also known as Indigenous Peoples Reality Media. I would like to invite you to spend this hour with us, with my special guest, my friend, and my brother for a long time. His name is Mark Charles. Mark Charles is from the Navajo Nation. Mark Charles is also a minister, but most importantly, recently, Mark Charles was the Native American that ran for the 2020 presidency as an independent candidate. Mark Charles, how are you, man?
I'm doing well, Jay. Thank you. It's good to be with you tonight.
Absolutely. So here we are, almost at the end of 2020, with all of the fallout that's happened over the last 4 years. Excuse me, we tried to change that. I voted for you, but I'm sorry.
Yeah, we worked hard. It was a very good experience. I'm very glad I had a chance to run this last 18 months, and it gave me a very good perspective on not only what changes we need to make in our nation, but what we need to do to get those changes to happen.
Okay, Mark, we've talked many times, and I would like to kind of start this conversation with the papal bulls, the doctrine of discovery. And you got a lot to say, but you can't say a lot tonight. So would you give us a brief summary of what it is that you have highlighted all of the years as a scholar of the doctrine of discovery? Go right ahead.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And before that, even just to kind of counter what the doctrine of discovery says, I want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from Washington, D.C., and these are the lands of the Piscataway. And I want to honor the Piscataway, and I want to thank them. They are the indigenous peoples to these lands. They are the hosts of these lands, and I am humbled to be living on their lands today. The doctrine of discovery, my 30-second elevator speech it's a series of papal bulls, edicts of the Catholic Church, written between 1452 and 1493. Says things like invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, reduce them to perpetual slavery, convert them to profit and exploitation. And it's essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are less than human and their land is yours to take. This is literally the doctrine that the European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in this new world, which was already inhabited by millions, and claimed to have discovered it. My book, Unsettling Truths, that I wrote with my good friend and co-author, Soong-Chan Rah, one of the first sentences in our book says, you cannot discover lands already inhabited. You can steal those lands. You can conquer those lands. You can even colonize those lands. You can't discover them. No. Unless you believe the people who live there are not fully human, which is the problem, the challenge with the doctrine of discovery. So the problem with the doctrine is it gets embedded into the foundations of our nation. We have a Declaration of Independence that refers to natives as merciless Indian savages. We have a constitution that never mentions women, counts Africans as 3/5 of a person, specifically excludes natives. We have foundations that are littered with racism, sexism, and white supremacy. And this is why we face so many of the challenges that we face today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And one of the people that really pushed this doctrine of discovery was President Abraham Lincoln. And I'm really surprised at him doing that because he was a Melungeon Indian. I mean, he was white, he was black, he had black roots, and he also had native roots. But he was considered as an Indian killer. He was a part of the Illinois militia that killed Indians. So this whole colonization and this doctrine of discovery and and everything that it represented has washed down from the time the Europeans first landed here to the time of Lincoln and even up to where we are today. Would you agree?
Yeah, we have 2 chapters in our book specifically devoted to Abraham Lincoln. Unbeknownst to most people, he throughout his entire life was a blatant white supremacist.
Yeah.
And he was one of the most genocidal presidents in the history of our country, literally ethnically cleansing the tribes from Minnesota, Colorado, and the territory of New Mexico to make way for the Transcontinental Railway. One of the questions I ask people, one of the statements I make with people all the time is, I cannot even imagine how many Native lives were saved because he was assassinated in 1865. He was becoming so prolific. In fact, in 1863, he began the ethnic cleansing of my people in the Four Corners area through the Long Walk. Literally rounded up about 10,000, 9 to 10,000 of our people marched us down to Bosque Redondo, and a quarter of our people died while imprisoned in that death camp there. So he was literally, to complete the Transcontinental Railway and complete Manifest Destiny, he was literally ethnically cleansing all the states that were in the route of that railway.
Well, there's been a long history of those types of actions. Some of us call them genocidal practices. Some of them are just downright totally disgusting. There were 112 million of our people, Mark, from the East Coast to the West Coast of what they call these United States. And by the time the 1930s rolled around, they had murdered over 100 million of our people from shore to shiny shore.
Yeah, when there's a lot of different population estimates throughout of what the native population was in our country, but the genocide rate, even if you take a very conservative number of 6,000 to 9,000, the genocide rate, the lowest number it got down to was in 1870. When they did a census and they counted, and this isn't just the natives who were assimilated living in among society. This is the savage natives that they called us, living out on uncharted lands and in the territories, reservations. There was 237,000.
Right.
So even if we start with a conservative number like maybe 6 to 8 million, that's still a 96% rate of genocide.
Exactly.
That's astronomically higher than even what Adolf Hitler had in World War II with the Holocaust of the Jews.
Well, Mark, we've suffered a lot and we've gone through so much, but still we rise. We're still here. I would like to move a little further up into this history of this country. Let's talk a while about how we got to where we are today. We know about the genocide. We know about in Virginia when Walter Flecker tried to not allow Indian children to have anything on their birth certificate other than mulatto or colored. We can talk about the boarding schools and how they kidnapped our children from our various tribal nations and forced them to go 2,000 and 3,000 miles away from where they lived to these boarding schools. First thing they did was cut their hair. And if they would dare speak their native tongue, they were beaten. This was a way of, they also said that we're going to kill the Indian, but save the man. How can you do that? Physically, you can't do that. So mentally and spiritually, that was their great attempt. Would you agree?
Yeah, that phrase was used by Richard Pratt, who was the Army captain who kind of came up with the idea of the boarding schools, and the goal was to forcibly assimilate. The interesting thing is he gave a speech in 1892, and that's where he laid out his vision of killing the Indian to save the man. 1892 was 2 years after the massacre at Wounded Knee. And literally up from the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s of the 1800s, this nation was actively committing genocide against Native peoples. And I think after the massacre at Wounded Knee, where 350 Dakota men, women, and children were slaughtered in that single day, 20 Congressional Medals of Honor were given to the soldiers who participated in that massacre. The nation was losing some of their stomach for that outright genocide. And so they came up with the idea of forcibly assimilating, kill the Indian to save the man, is that's what they called it. And it's fascinating about that phrase and that speech by Richard Pratt is when right after he made that statement, he said that he compared it to slavery. And he said, as horrible, as horrific as slavery was, it bestowed upon the African the greatest blessing they've ever received, which is, he said, it brought them from cannibalism and savagery in Africa to becoming English-speaking and civilized here in America. And he said, and how did that happen and so quickly? Through association, by allowing them to associate with members of the higher race, is what he said. Again, they're slave owners. They became civilized and English speaking. And so the thinking was, if this happened by chance, just because they were associated with slave owners through the act of enslavement, he was thinking, how much more quicker will that happen if we take Native children out of their homes, put them in military trials and boarding schools, and forcibly assimilate them? And so he was trying to speed up the process that they saw happen, you know. And so this is the challenge with white supremacy, is to the white supremacist mind, the greatest blessing that they can bestow on the subhumans is to let us associate with them and assimilate to their culture, language, and worldview. This is what made the boarding schools so absolutely dangerous and very, very destructive for not only the students who are in the schools, but for these generations and for the historical trauma that came from generations to communities after the boarding schools.
You know, one experience, a good friend of mine, Dennis Banks, he was one of the founders of AIM, the American Indian Movement. And he was a product of the boarding schools. He kept running away. And so many other children continued to run away from boarding schools because it wasn't home. It didn't feel like home. It was dominance. The Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. If you go out back of that Carlisle School, there are over 500 unmarked graves of children that were killed in these boarding schools. You know,
I visited that graveyard.
Oh man, it's really an atrocity. So we're talking basically about the policies of the United States of America and how it came to be what it is today. Let's talk a little bit about you visited the Lincoln Memorial and you went into that bookshop downstairs, right?
There's that small museum at the base of the memorial, yeah.
So what was it that really really got you?
Well, you know, you have the small museum. Most people don't even know it's there because it's at the base of the memorial. You have to go down instead of up the stairs to the memorial. The people who do find it usually are the ones looking for the bathroom because it's right next door to the bathroom. And it's the size of a large mid-sized classroom. And on each wall, there's plaques, marble plaques. They're about the size of a door, maybe a little bit smaller, maybe 4 feet tall, 2.5 feet wide. And there's writings and sayings of Abraham Lincoln's speeches and of his writings on these plaques. And one wall has a series of his sayings and thoughts about the Union. And one of the center plaques, it says, "I would save the Union. My primary object in this struggle, the Civil War," wrote Abraham Lincoln, "is not to save or destroy slavery, it's to preserve the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." There's this plaque which is hanging at the Lincoln Memorial, literally saying, according to Abraham Lincoln, Black lives don't matter.
Mm-hmm.
I was standing next to that plaque. I like to go down there on President's Day and around Abraham Lincoln's birthday, and I like to just stand by that plaque and watch people kind of shuffle by it. And you know, everyone believes Abraham Lincoln was our greatest president. And I was standing there one day, and this African American family came in, and they came down the row. They looked at the plaques. They stood right next to me and looked at the plaque I just quoted to you, and they moved on. And I tapped the gentleman on the shoulder. I said, "Excuse me, did you read that plaque?" He said, "What?" I said, "Did you see what that plaque said?" I said, "It says, according to Abraham Lincoln, Black lives don't matter." He looked at me like I was crazy. He looked back at the plaque. He read it. His eyes kind of like dropped. And he took out his phone, his camera, and he took a picture of it. And he's like, I can't, you know, we've been so conditioned to believe Abraham Lincoln was this great president fighting for the humanity of people of color, not acknowledging that he was actually a blatant white supremacist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we're not conditioned to see it, even when it's right in front of our eyes. We don't, oh yes, that's great, he loved the Union, instead of realizing what he's saying is he doesn't believe Black lives matter.
Or Native lives either.
I mean, yeah, like I said, he was one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history, literally killing thousands of Native peoples to make way for the Transcontinental Railway. So, in fact, our Navajo people, we were at Bosque Redondo. We were in the middle of the removal that we had from our land when he was assassinated. We didn't come back to our land until after Abraham Lincoln had been killed and was no longer in office.
Okay. So white supremacy didn't just start yesterday.
No, white. I was talking with another scholar today about the doctrine of discovery, and he was telling me, I was kind of sharing with him some of my research on Abraham Lincoln, and he was telling me some of the research that he's done on this is Bob Miller, who's done a lot of reading and writing on this. He's a law professor at ASU, and he was telling me about the research he's done on Thomas Jefferson, and the way Thomas Jefferson and even George Washington absolutely believed that natives weren't fully human, and they espoused the doctrine of discovery throughout their entire public lives.
And both of those guys were slave owners.
Again, this is the challenge we have.
Didn't matter then, and they don't matter today to a majority of the people, white people in this country.
Yeah,
Mark, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, this is the challenge that we have. You know, one of the critiques I made throughout my campaign, the goal of my campaign was to build a nation where we, the people, really for the first time, truly means all the people. You know, and when you read our foundations, the reason, the focus of the foundations is to elevate, to protect, to advocate for white landowning men.
Right.
Not for women, not for people of color, not for people from the margins. And I remember it was in 2016, I was listening to President Obama give his final State of the Union. And he was lamenting all of the divisiveness that he had experienced as our nation's first Black president. And he was calling for our nation to have a new politics. And in his speech, he said, he quoted the Constitution. He said, "We the people, our Constitution begins with these three simple words. Words that we've come to recognize mean all the people." That sounds beautiful, but it's not true. We've never decided, we've never made the intentional choice that we the people means all the people. His vice president, now our president-elect, makes the exact same mistake. Joe Biden frequently misquotes the Declaration of Independence. He says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." I believe all men and women are created equal. You believe all men and women are created equal. The Declaration of Independence does not.
That's right.
What it states is, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. When Joe Biden doesn't acknowledge what it says, he's not going to be able to fix the problem.
Okay, so now that we are in December of 2020, and we got just a few weeks left before this, I'm going to be nice, this sitting idiot president is out of office. What do you see? What do you expect? Or what do you desire of the Biden Harris team to do for we the people?
I have very low expectations of the Biden Harris administration. I was very pleased that Joe Biden selected a woman of color as his vice presidential candidate. I'm glad that that glass ceiling has been broken and that we have a vice president-elect who is a woman and a woman of color. I think that's a very good step. But Joe Biden was very, he was very firm, very adamant throughout his campaign that he is going to maintain the status quo. He's not going to deal with the systemic issues that we have as a nation. And what's interesting is even if you look, because I often wondered about Senator Harris, now Vice President-elect Harris, because during the primary debates, she actually very effectively called out the implicit racial bias of Joe Biden. And she talked about, what he had done as vice president and as a senator. And she called him on issues of race and his implicit racial bias very frequently and very effectively throughout the primary season.
Yeah, I remember that.
And so I was a little, I don't know if confused was the right word. I was surprised that he selected her as his vice presidential candidate. But I was actually listening to, so I was doing some research, and most natives know that when she was attorney general in California, she did not have the best record on native issues.
That's true.
And she actually did not have the best record on the incarceration rates of people of color while she was attorney general.
That's true. That's very true.
And so while Joe Biden was effectively helping craft that policing legislation that came out in the 90s, Senator Harris, Kamala Harris, Attorney General Harris, was in California enforcing that law and enforcing those policies. And there was a very interesting podcast I listened to. I want to say it was put out by NPR that looked at Kamala Harris's record, not only as Attorney General in California, but even back to when she first got into law and even into her early life. While I think she has been very clear that she wants to bring other people of color to the table, one of the things she's demonstrated throughout her career is that she's not going to be the person who's going to turn the table. She's not going to be the one who's going to kind of flip it over and say, yeah, we have to. She's, like I said, Joe Biden was writing this policing law. So, this is the challenge. And so once I saw that and I looked at that more closely, I suddenly realized, okay, this is why Joe Biden selected her. Because he is adamant about maintaining the status quo, at least. I'm very glad he's breaking traditions. He's bringing in more women into not only his vice presidential position, but into his cabinet. He's bringing more diversity into his cabinet and things like that. But he was clear that at a foundational level, dealing with the foundations of our nation, he is not going to address those things. And we saw this very clearly after the lynching of George Floyd.
Right.
After the lynching of George Floyd, President Trump came out and he gave an executive order banning certain chokeholds. And Joe Biden went on record and he repeated himself numerous times, including during the general election debates, that he thinks we should retrain officers to shoot people in the kneecaps instead of in the chest. This was their solutions. I, on the other hand, was the only candidate advocating and saying, if we want to address lynchings, public lynchings, like what we saw with George Floyd, we have to abolish slavery.
Exactly.
We have to get rid of this at a foundational level. And not only was Joe Biden not open to having a discussion about something like defunding the police, But he was saying, no, we need to actually fund them more. We have to double down on this. We have to, and so he's not willing to address this at a foundational level. So I've been telling people, if you've protested issues of race or the environment at any point over the last 12 to 16 years, you absolutely better be prepared to protest them over the next 4. Because while Joe Biden will have a better demeanor, while he'll be a bit nicer, while he's not going to be as crass, he absolutely is not going to change things at a foundational level.
Well,
And he was very clear about that throughout his entire campaign.
What got me was when he made the statement that he's not going to go after Trump for him breaking all the laws that he broke. What do you think about that? Because it makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, even a child in its mother's womb could see just how bad Donald Trump has been to not just the United States of America.
Well, and this is one of the challenges, is what really propelled Joe Biden into office was not that he was the best on policies. It's not that he had the best vision and the most unifying of all of the candidates. It's that he wasn't Trump. He was a white landowning male, part of the establishment, who wasn't Donald Trump. And that's what he rode into office. It's fascinating, and this is one of the things we've been talking about Abraham Lincoln, right? And how he was a blatant white supremacist who committed genocide against Native peoples. And what was the organization that unified moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats to support Joe Biden? What was that organization called? It was a super PAC called the Lincoln Project.
Exactly.
Right?
Yep.
So again, and what's also fascinating, and I don't know why we didn't hear more about this during the general election, because Indian country overwhelmingly voted for Joe Biden, right? Now, in 2020, we had something really fascinating happen with our presidential election, which is for the first time, we had a Native forum that drew top tier presidential candidates. It was the Frank Lemire Forum that happened in Sioux City, Iowa in August of 2019. And it drew thousands of Native peoples and 10 of the top Democratic candidates as well. I was there as well as an independent. I think there was 1 or 2 Republicans there, but it was a major presidential forum hosted by and for Indian country. And you know who didn't show up? You know who wasn't there? Bernie Sanders was there. Elizabeth Warren was there. Kamala Harris was there. Julian Castro was there. Marianne Williamson was there. I was there. You know who wasn't there?
Joe Biden.
Joe Biden. And then they had another one in January of 2020. They had another one in Las Vegas. And this was during the impeachment hearings. And so most of the other candidates didn't show up in person because they were doing in the impeachment hearings. So Senator Harris was in the hearings, and Cory Booker was in the hearings, and Elizabeth Warren was in the hearings. So, but they several of them showed up on a video call. You know what Joe Biden did? He sent a letter.
I know.
He wrote a letter. So in the one election where candidates for the very first time were openly and actively campaigning to Native peoples, do you know who wasn't doing that? Joe Biden.
Yeah. Well, Mark, we have so many issues that I would like to talk about, but one of the main ones is this pandemic. Donald Trump knew way back in January that this was coming. Minister Louis Farrakhan also told his followers that something's coming. Now, how could this be on the table of the American president and he just sits on it and does nothing until it becomes a pandemic? Well, he went to the hospital, claimed he had COVID-19. So how could he go to the hospital and come out in 3 days? Well, I got a theory. I know a lot of people don't want to hear this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Every major catastrophic sickness that hit this world, including the Spanish flu, which did not come from Spain, it came out of Oklahoma. I believe in my heart of hearts that when these man made pandemics happen, health wise, that they already have the antidote somewhere. And this whole mess about the virus, about the vaccines. Well, if Trump had it, how could he go to the hospital and come back in 3 days and he's okay? Maybe he got the antidote. That's just the way I feel.
Yeah,
What's your thoughts?
I'm not going to delve into conspiracy theories on this, but the thing that I do know,
Are
is
you
a lot of
calling me a
people,
conspiracy theorist?
a lot of the things that people tend to forget, is when you're dealing with Donald Trump, you are dealing with a man who I would make two observations about him. A, I think he's a deeply wounded man, and he lives in a binary where he either has to be the hero or the victim of every situation he's in.
That's right.
And so there's no other option. There's no middle ground. He's either the hero of the world or he's the victim and the scapegoat of the world. And there's no in between ground. And people forget that about him. I'm convinced from what I observe in him, there seems to be some deep woundedness in him where he can't see the world outside of that binary. Second, he displays all of the classic symptoms of narcissism.
Right.
And one of the, actually it was in 2016, after he came into office, I did some research on narcissism and, what narcissism does to the family, what it does to the relationships around the narcissist, because I knew what we were going into as a nation. And one of the things that I learned about narcissists is they create chaos that then they can be the solution for. And so one of the things that makes narcissists so exhausting is they create a world of chaos, and then they present themselves as the solution to lead or to fix that chaos. And how many times did we see Donald Trump do this? He would tweet something or say something or do something that would create this reaction and this buzz and this anxiety. And then he would back off from it, or he would change it, or he would say something else to counter it. Again, now he's the solution to the chaos that he himself caused. And when you're dealing with a narcissist, you lack the ability to feel empathy. Everything is about you. You have to put yourself in the center of every single thing. And people tend to forget that, again, I haven't diagnosed him, but when you observe him, and you look up the symptoms and the characteristics of narcissism, you see that in Donald Trump. And I think people tend to forget that when we're dealing with our president, we're dealing with someone who at least presents many of the characteristics of someone who is struggling deeply with narcissism. And so you can't interact with him just as a normal person. You have to remember he lives in this binary, and I'm convinced that's what he's doing now. He knows good and well he lost this election. Yeah. He knows he lost it. He is trying to find a way that he can spin the narrative where he's either a winner or he's a victim. And that's what right now is he's trying to find that narrative so that he can sell that, because his whole brand is based on him being a winner, right? He's the art of the deal. Everything about him is he's a winner, he's a winner, he's a winner. And so now that he's lost, now he has to either find a way to emerge the winner or to be painted and shown to be this horrible victim of this horrible fraud and injustice. And so I think, I think he knows very well that he's lost this election. He just can't concede it until he figures out how he can make this narrative fit some way so that it doesn't tarnish or ruin his brand, which is that he has to be a winner or he has to be a victim.
Every court that his lawyers have gone to in all of these different states basically said there's no fraud. The next person that's going to be fired from his cabinet is the guy that's in charge of the Justice Department.
Yeah,
Bert,
Barr came
yeah,
out yesterday and
yeah.
said they found no fraud. They found no evidence of fraud that would change the outcome of the election. And
He's
then
going to
he
keep
had
firing.
a
He's
two
going
and
to
a
keep
half hour
firing.
meeting at the White House.
He's going to keep firing people. There's nobody left in his cabinet, and he's not going to have any friends. But that's his problem. Mark,
Yeah.
what do you think? No, what would you do if you had been elected as the president this time about the pandemic of the coronavirus, COVID-19? What would be on your agenda? Would that be one of the first things that you would tackle?
Well, the first thing I would tackle is well, first of all, there's there's several things I would want to address.
Mhm.
The one of the first things I would want to address is to make sure that people trust this vaccine,
Mhm.
because I think this is something that we're not, what we saw with Operation Warp Speed, which was the government working with industry, working with corporations to get a vaccine to the table with warp speed.
Mhm.
Now, the challenge with that is corporations and industry have the priority of making money, and
Yeah.
government has the responsibility for making sure things are safe.
Mhm.
Right. So we just saw the challenge when government and industry get too cozy with each other with what happened with the Boeing 737.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Where
Mhm.
the FAA gave a lot of the approval processes over to Boeing, and then Boeing didn't, govern it
Didn't
or
live
didn't
up to. Yeah, they
regulate
didn't.
itself well. And we had a plane that kept crashing because we had a faulty system on it. And so when we have government and industry working to get a vaccine to the public at a warp speed, and then the other concern I have is, and I agree with President-elect Biden, that we have to trust scientists and we have to believe in scientists.
Yeah.
But there is some effect that Donald Trump has on the scientists around him, where we've seen this repeatedly, whether it's his own doctors, we've even seen it in Dr. Fauci, which is when they're standing on the stage with President Trump, they will say one thing, and when they're removed from him, they will say something different. So we've even seen Dr. Fauci walk back some comments that he said when he was standing next to President Trump, and then he'll walk it back a day or two later when he's on just another interview with someone else. And so one of the things I think we have, and I just heard a news report this morning that I think it's I forget what the number is, 40% of Americans aren't sure if they trust the vaccine. And so one of the things that I would do as president is I would basically go back and do whatever we had to do to make that approval process that's already happened both looked at, double checked, and as absolutely transparent as possible, because I would want people to know that they can trust this vaccine.
That it's
That's
safe.
what I want people to know. The second thing I would do is I think, we have, I'm estimating or guessing that we're going to live in a disrupted world for at least another 9 to 12 months. It's not going to be until late spring, early summer until we get the vaccine out to everyone. But even then, we still have to work on developing a vaccine for children. And so I don't think air travel, business travel, or large gatherings are going to be back to normal until probably the end of 2021.
Yes.
And so we need to start continuing to plan right now for, we see all the problems, especially with younger children, with doing virtual learning and online learning. We have to bridge this digital divide that we have. We have to make sure that our teachers are trained to continue doing this, because I think we're going to have some sort of online learning, even if it's just a few days a week throughout the next year. So we have to begin planning for that now. The other thing I would do, and this is one of the things, and I've tweeted this several times, we're almost to the point of having a vaccine. We haven't had stimulus in this country since last spring. And one of the problems is when you look at the leadership of our Congress, the 10 leaders of Congress from both houses, both parties, 7 of those 10 leaders have been in office since the 1990s. They've been in office, and that means throughout the Great Recession, throughout numerous government shutdowns, and throughout the campaign, they have experienced no income insecurity, no food insecurity, no mortgage insecurity, all these things that this nation has experienced over and over and over again. Most of our congressional leaders haven't experienced any of that, which is why both sides of the aisle are not adamant. They're not committed to making sure that we get some sort of relief to Main Street America. And so, I've said this when on the campaign trail, and I would say this now: if I were elected president, both Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi would be spending an awful lot of time in my office. They would be sitting down with me, negotiating with each other, and we would get stimulus done, and we would make sure it wasn't just about protecting Wall Street. This was about protecting everyday Americans. And the other thing I would do is we have to actually make sure that we're taking care of the people we are calling essential workers. We hail these people, whether it's our healthcare workers, our nurses, our food delivery people, our grocery stores, our people working in the food industry. We hail these people as essential workers, but we pay them and we treat them like they're expendable.
Yes. Yeah.
So just today, there was a report that came out where the CDC, I think, was going to recommend that nursing homes and healthcare workers get the first rounds of the vaccine. And I think we have to, those are some good priorities to have, but we have to get essential workers, the people we've identified as essential workers, and whether they're working in a grocery store, whether they're picking, our crops and out in the field, the people we have determined are essential workers during this pandemic, we have to get them the vaccine as absolutely quickly as possible. And we have to stop treating them as they're expendable. We have to treat them as essential, which is what we're calling them.
First-class workers.
Absolutely.
So, Mark, where do we go from here?
Where do we go from here in regards to what?
And how we turn this mess around that Trump has created. Iran had a nuclear scientist assassinated. Well, they didn't have him assassinated, but a nuclear Iranian.
One of their scientists was assassinated. Their head nuclear scientist was assassinated, yes.
And Trump comes out of his mouth with a statement, well, I support the efforts of Israel. And Israel is the ones that the Iranians are pointing their fingers to as far as this man being assassinated. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I've been following that story fairly closely, and I don't know the evidence around it yet, so I'm not in a place where I can make a judgment of what did happen and what didn't happen. I know there were several statements that Prime Minister Netanyahu made over the past year that led people to believe this was a possibility. But yeah, I think what troubles me the most is we know that Donald Trump has done some fairly explicit things to help. He's moved the embassy from Tel Aviv into Jerusalem. Both parties, Republicans and Democrats, are huge supporters of Israel. Mm-hmm. And while I completely agree Israel has a right to exist, mm-hmm. I do not agree with the way that both the United States and Israel claim this destiny of promised land, which is a quote that Benjamin Netanyahu used in 2015 when he was addressing a joint session of our Congress. He said, America Israel have a destiny of promised lands. When you have promised lands, according to the Old Testament, that gives you the right to oppress the people living in your promised lands or even commit genocide against them.
Mm-hmm.
And so for both these nations, the United States and Israel, to claim a destiny of promised lands is a way to justify our history of enslavement and genocide against Native peoples and the modern nation states of Israel's current situation of oppression against Bedouins and Palestinians. And so one of the things that I want to look at very closely is this very dysfunctional relationship that our nation has with the modern nation state of Israel around this legacy of promised lands, this misappropriation of this theology of promised lands that comes out of the Old Testament of the Bible. And so, I think we need to, so if, well, I don't even want to speculate on that because I don't know what happened with that assassination.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
there are some things about our relationship with Israel that I think we need to address. One of the things that I advocated for and I said I would do if I became president, I think it's great right now that Deb Haaland, her name is at least being floated as a possible nominee for Secretary of the Interior,
Department,
which
right.
I would fully support that. I would
Me
love to see her on Joe Biden's cabinet. I think she would be a great candidate for that. When I was running, I said one of the things I would love to do is to nominate a Native American for my Secretary of State.
Yes.
And one of the reasons I want to do this is because over the past, and what was made obvious just over the past 9 months with the lynching of George Floyd and all the other racial problems that we have, is we have a lot of challenges domestically that we're facing regarding our history of racism, sexism, and white supremacy. We've had almost no discussion about how our racist and sexist and white supremacist foundations have impacted our foreign policy. And when we look at our closest allies, our NATO allies and our closest allies around the world, almost all of our allies are colonial nations. Many of them who colonized North America and South America and the New World, and others who colonized huge parts of the rest of the world.
Yes.
And so while I'm advocating that we have to deal as a nation with our own history, we have to have some very pointed conversations with our allies and basically say, what is it that holds us together? What are our common values? Are they colonialism? Or are they actually the benefit and the welfare of the global population? And so Israel is one of the nations I want to have one of those conversations with. The UK, France, Germany, the Netherlands, all these nations, Australia, New Zealand, all these nations that are our allies, but have these deep, deep roots of colonialism throughout their history that they've never fully reconciled with. They've never fully dealt with that history. And I think having a Native American Secretary of State, having a Native person be the primary ambassador for this country would help us have these conversations with our allies so that we can actually begin to detangle ourselves from our colonial past and our colonial histories.
We got 5 minutes left, but I want to ask you a question. How do you unburn a bridge? Okay, the reason I ask you that, Donald Trump has burned so many bridges with countries that were allies. And it's almost to the point that nobody trusts this United States government anymore.
Yeah.
How, and I'm tired of looking at his picture too, how would you unburn bridges other than to put the fire out?
Well, one of the things that I'm very I feel very strongly about is Donald Trump is absolutely and has been a problem for our nation.
Yes.
But he's not the root of our problems.
No.
And these are things we've been doing for 250 years as a country. I actually, So one of the things that I want to make very clear is just because Donald Trump is no longer going to be in office and Joe Biden is going to be in office, that's not going to change our history or our values. And so Joe Biden will be nicer. He will have a better demeanor than Donald Trump did, but his core values are not that much different. And so one of the things that I think, one of the conversations I would begin working on with, yes, right now there's some brokenness between especially our NATO allies and our European allies and the United States because of the demeanor that President Trump had. But Joe Biden is going to restore those relationships, but he's not going to address the colonial roots that's at the root of those relationships. And so where I would want to come in, and this is why one of the reasons I ran in 2020 is because I would love to have come in after Donald Trump while these relationships were already broken. And instead of saying, let's build them back to the status quo we had 4, 8, or 12 years ago, let's actually take a long, hard look at our relationships. What are our shared values? And what of these values do we need to change so that we can all be better citizens in a global community? And so I would actually want to use the fact that these relationships are broken and need to be rebuilt as a way to build them back with a different foundation that's not based on colonialism. And right now, if you're honest, all of our relationships with our closest allies are all based on our histories of colonialism.
So how do we stop that? Colonialism.
I'm telling people, this is why I've said to people, if you protested any of these issues over the past 12 years, be prepared to protest them for 4 more. Joe Biden will be nicer. He will not be as explicit. He will not be as mean. He will not be as harsh or as rash as Donald Trump was. But his values are not that far off as far as what those values are centered on. And again, our foundations are what the problem is. And Joe Biden made it very clear he's not going to deal with our foundations. And so my solution, I haven't made a final decision, but I am very much looking forward to the possibility of running again in 2024. I'm convinced that we have to have this national dialogue on race, gender, and class. I'm convinced we have to create this common memory, and I'm convinced we have to remove the racism, the sexism, and the white supremacy from our foundations. We have to still decide. I still want to call the question, do we want to be a nation where we the people truly means all the people? Joe Biden is not going to get us there. Just like Donald Trump was not going to get us there, just like President Obama did not get us there. We have to make the intentional choice of saying, yes, this was our past, and we're going to choose something different. And we've never made that choice.
So in essence, what you're saying is we need to break the mold of colonialism.
We absolutely do.
Mark, it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Jay. I love being on your show. It's great to talk with you. I'm so glad you have this platform that you can speak from now, and I wish you the best of luck as you keep your platform going and keep your voice out there.
As long as I got friends and brothers like you, it will continue. Absolutely. Mark, give my love to your family, and look to see you soon.
I'll look forward to it, Jay. Yeah.
Hopefully somebody will come up with a solution to this COVID virus, and then we can still hang out like we used to.
That'd be nice. That'd be very nice.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Jay.
As I stop and think about this conversation that I've had with my good friend Mark Charles, I can't help but reflect on how I wish things were. I remember my grandparents, my mom's people, who were Cherokees from South Carolina. As a matter of fact, they were some of those Cherokees that some of their ancestors were the ones that fought against Andrew Jackson when they tried to put everybody on the Trail of Tears. Part of my family went up into the mountains in South Carolina and fought back. They didn't go on the trail. Stop and think about my grandfather, Paul, and how he was always a straightforward, righteous man. Couldn't say that about the words that came out of his mouth, but his heart was in the right place. And my grandma, Sylvia, his wife, Sylvia Robles Cruz, who came to the United States from Puerto Rico, a Taino Indian woman. And I think about all of these values that they instilled in their children, my parents, my aunts and uncles, and how things were then. Mark mentioned that the United States Constitution did not include women. But if you grew up in the household I grew up in, and if you were of native blood, you knew that the women were in charge. And the reason we have men as chiefs of tribes is because when that white man came across the Atlantic Ocean, he would not talk to a woman in power. So it was our women that put men in those positions of leadership and power, but instructed them that you will do the will of the people. If not, we will snatch you out of office. Men that are listening and watching this broadcast, we owe a heck of a lot to our women. Women are to be honored, respected, revered. They're not your punching bag or anything else like that. So if you're looking for answers, you can't sit back and wait for any government or president or leadership to give you those answers. You need to go and read the books. I have many books here. I have over 7,000 personal books in my house, and I've read them all. A lot of people fail to understand what's right in front of them because they have no knowledge of what it's all about. Go and read a book. And sit down and read a book with your children. My grandfather would always say that it's not about the pigmentation of your skin or the color of your eyes or the texture of your hair. It's not about the clothes you wear. It's not about your culture or your traditions or that deity that you pray to and call God. It's not about any of that. I'll close with these words of Grandpa. It's not about any of that. Do you know what it's really all about? How you treat my heart. That's what it's all about. Your brother or sister do not have to look like you to be your brother or your sister. All white people are not bad. There's a lot of good white people out here. All native people are not good. Just like all black people are not good. Dr. Martin Luther King made a statement that I live by. It's not about the color of my skin. It's about the content of my character. It's what's in here, my heart. So until we talk again next week, I'll leave you with these words in Cherokee. Danada, Goai, Wado. This has been Winter Nightwolf Live, the Indigenous Peoples Reality Media. Talk to you again next Wednesday. Same time, 7 o'clock.